Resident Evil series has always walked a fine line between survival horror and action. In its early days, fear was the central focus. Later, the series leaned it more into action, but it's a part of Resident Evil that I've always found intriguing. Welcome back to the world of survival horror. In Resident Evil's early games, fear was one of the main driving focuses of the franchise. Limited ammo, claustrophobic environments, and slow-moving yet relentless enemies. It kind of created an atmosphere of dread. Games like Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 excelled at making people feel vulnerable and cautious, with resource management playing a crucial role in the survival. However, the series progressed, particularly with Resident Evil 4, where the balance began to shift. Resident Evil 4, celebrated as one of the greatest games of all time, it leaned heavily into action-packed sequences and over-the-top set pieces. This trend continued in Resident Evil 5 and 6, where the fear factor took a backseat to explosive combat and co-op gameplay. The return to a more horror-focused experience with Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village was seen as a course correction by many fans. These games emphasized isolated settings, limited resources, and disturbing enemy designs, successfully recapturing some of the original tension. This evolution wasn't accidental. It was a response to changing market demands, player expectations, and the overall direction of the gaming industry. What is quite interesting, well, for me at least, is that you can actually see this evolution of fear change across the games. In the early days, it's survival horror. Like I said, limited resources, claustrophobic environments, and an overwhelming sense of dread. To achieve this fear in the player, we had fixed camera angles so you couldn't see what was coming around the corner, tank controls which made aiming and shooting or just running away just a little bit harder, and limited ammo and inventory spaces. You had to plan your route. It was decided what items to carry or which zombies to shoot and which to avoid. It was all about the fear of the unknown. That first time you see the iconic zombie head turn, it sends genuine shivers down your spine. However, in order to keep the franchise fresh and with the advancement of technology, sticking with the same formula would have been a death sentence for Resident Evil. So, with 4, they shifted gears. Resident Evil 4 introduced a over-the-camera shoulder, faster-paced combat, and a stronger emphasis on action. Capcom aimed to modernize the series, appealing to a broader audience as the action games were becoming more mainstream at the time. While Resident Evil 4 retained the horror elements, the regenerators and the chainsaw man, Leon's increased combat abilities, over-the-shoulder camera, and powerful weapons gave players more control and confidence. It's widely celebrated as one of the greatest games, but it also set a precedent that later entries tried and failed to replicate. Fear shifted from a personal vulnerability to situational overwhelm. Less about feeling weak and more about surviving possible odds. After all, Leon wasn't now just surviving, he is thriving, capable of headshots, suplexes, roundhouse kicks, you name it. A couple of great examples are the village siege and the cabin sequences, a blend of action and horror. You're surrounded by enemies, yet fully equipped to fight back. However, in their attempt to outdo the previous titles, they inadvertently removed the fear from Resident Evil 5 and 6, although it is evident they tried to put this back in for 6, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. You see, the introduction of co-op gameplay with Sheva fundamentally changed the tone. The game emphasized shooting over survival, with fewer moments of genuine fear. Chris and Sheva felt more like soldiers than survivors, with enough firepower to take down an army, but the horror takes a back seat, more to the bombastic cinematic action sequences. Thus, co-op removed one of horror's most effective tools, loneliness. Because it's hard to feel scared when your characters feel like superheroes. It's been said that Chris punching a boulder in Resident Evil 5 is the moment Resident Evil abandoned fear entirely. Resident Evil 6 did try to make a course correction, but it wasn't enough. Because at the same time it attempted to cater for everyone. Leon's campaign leaned into the horror and the fear that was missing from Resident Evil 5. But then on the other hand, you had Chris into the military action and Jake's into the over-the-top combat. So yet, constant explosions, quick-time events, and chaotic enemy encounters kind of diluted the horror they were trying to put back in, which left many feeling that they had lost sight of what made Resident Evil special. That's when Resident Evil 7 came along, and it was a breath of fresh air. It abandoned the action-heavy formula in favour of first-person survival horror, we were back to limited ammo, inventory slots, and an isolated setting. It kind of focused on that claustrophobic setting reminiscent of the old games. The eerie atmosphere, the helplessness, brought genuine terror back to the series. I remember holding my breath in real life, just hiding from Marguerite, because you had no idea if she could see you, and the only way to know if she was coming would be to stick your head out. Now, come on, how risky is that? Village attempted to blend the horror of Resident Evil 7 with the combat confidence of Resident Evil 4, and I think it worked to a degree. I much prefer the slower pace of Resident Evil 7, but then I come back from falling in love when it was a slower paced game. Resident Evil Village brings back some of the action elements that fans who fell in love with the series later on in its journey would appreciate. The fear of 7 was still there. The grotesque to oversized baby creature stalking Ethan through the dimly lit basement creates one of the game's most terrifying moments. Yet Ethan's standoff against waves of lichens takes us back to Resident Evil 4's village scene. The question of whether Resident Evil can fully return to its survival horror origins is complex. It involves balancing fan expectations, market demands, and Capcom's vision for the series. While Resident Evil 7 and Village marked a significant step back towards horror, the franchise has evolved so much that a pure return to its root is going to be unrealistic. Today's players expect their fluid controls, responsive combat, and a greater agency in gameplay. The classic tank controls and fixed camera angles, while iconic, just wouldn't work with today's audience. The success of Resident Evil 4 set a precedent. Fans now expect a certain level of action and empowerment alongside those horror elements. And for once, I actually do have something positive to say about the remakes, because they showed that Resident Evil can revisit its survival horror roots without completely abandoning its modern expectations. Resident Evil 2 Remake successfully modernized the survival horror experience while staying faithful to the spirit of the original. Resident Evil 4 Remake balanced horror and action, refining rather than redefining the original. The truth is, Resident Evil doesn't need to abandon action or fully return to its roots to be scary. Fear can and should evolve alongside the series. Not to a point where it's been eliminated entirely, it can coexist. But horror needs an intentional design and a narrative focus. If Capcom continues to innovate while respecting the franchise's roots, taking the narrative horror from Resident Evils 1, 2 and 7 and adding in the action elements from Resident Evil 4 and Village, then Resident Evil will always have a place in survival horror. But it's no good getting the foundations correct of a great horror story if you don't know where you're going to go with your characters. And there's one character, I don't think they know where she's going. And to see that, well, then you need to watch the videos on screen now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button. And I'll see you survivors next time.